Welcome to LinkedIn Live with personal brand authority, Lita Citroen. Lita is an award-winning executive coach, speaker, and author working with clients in over 30 countries. She helps professionals, entrepreneurs, and business leaders manage the way they're perceived by the people who matter most. From leadership development, executive presence, to strategic communications and social media positioning, Lita's work is thoughtful, motivating, and practical. Get ready for a great program. Here's Lita.
Hello, friends. How are we today? We've made it through January and now we're into February. I hope you're all doing so well. As I get going, I know we have some of you dialing in from all over the world. I would love to hear from you. Go ahead and use the chat and tell us where you're dialing in from. What country or region of the world are you in? We're going to have an exciting program today. It's all me. So this session of LinkedIn Live, you're going to get me talking about a really important topic. So go ahead and tell us in the chat where you're calling in from or dialing in from, and we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about executive presence. When you hear the word executive presence, who comes to mind for you? Go ahead and put in the chat, who do you think of when you think of somebody having executive presence? Oh, hi from Tennessee. Oh, we got a lot from Kentucky, North Carolina, Michigan, Kenya. Very nice. We've got some friends from far away. Chicago, Arizona, Saudi Arabia. Ooh, place I would love to visit. Accra in Ghana. Actually, my son went there. Canada. Who comes to mind when you think of executive presence? Who do you think of? Oh, Andrea from Hungary. That's where my mother's actually from. Barack Obama comes to mind. Who else comes to mind when you think of somebody carrying executive presence? Oprah Winfrey. Okay. Ooh, Austria. I skied in Innsbruck, Austria. Beautiful country. Okay. Well, here are some names that typically come to mind when people think of executive presence, right? Definitely Barack Obama, definitely Oprah Winfrey. What about Queen Elizabeth II, who we recently lost? Does she carry executive presence? I see we've got Michelle Obama in the comments. Keep those countries coming in. We've got Kuwait in the room. The Cook Islands in the Pacific. Keep telling us where you're from. Athens. Oh, I spent some great summers in Greece, in Athens. Former New Zealand Prime Minister comes to mind when you think of executive presence. Well, you know, as common a phrase today as executive presence is, it's also one of the most hard to define and hard to understand. There was a recent study, and I found this statistic fascinating. Tracom Group recently did a study and asked HR professionals, what does it look like to have executive presence? And the overwhelming thought from these HR professionals, more than half of them said it's very important to growing your career, but it's really hard to identify what it is. We kind of know it when we see it, but we don't necessarily know what it is. So today we're going to take a deep dive in a real concentrated way on the topic of executive presence so that we can unpack some of the ingredients and then think about some action steps you can be doing to build your executive presence as you go out into the world. We have over 300 people signed up for today's program. And I got to tell you, it's going to be a lot of content. So however you take notes, all 300 of you, write it down, type it into your phone, however you're going to take notes. We're going to have a lot of content coming. So get ready. Why does executive presence matter? If it's so important, but we don't know what it is, why does it matter? Well, going back to some research, another study found that 30% of HR professionals, so these are people making decisions about hiring and promotions, are saying that it's a way that they can identify leadership potential. So we're seeing a direct correlation between executive presence and leadership potential. Really interesting. Can you be a leader without having executive presence? Might be a future topic. Executive presence, according to executives and business leaders, is what they say strengthens a company's culture. So another study found that if somebody has executive presence, they see that as an extension of the company brand and culture. And we know how important culture is to companies. And finally, in my own experience, I have found with the clients I've worked with all over the world that executive presence is what gives us the ability to walk into a room, command attention, and when we deliver a message, have that message land with impact and influence. So you're not just talking for the sake of talking, but your executive presence is what allows you to level up conversations and really bring that message into the ears of the people who need to hear it so that they can make decisions, so that they can act, so they see you as credible. So it's really important. You know, I am passionate about working with executives and entrepreneurs and teams around the world. One of the things that's going to be really important as I unpack the concept of executive presence is that we're always sensitive to cultural norms and differences. So I might be speaking from an American perspective here in the US, but different cultures have different nuances around topics like body language or delivery of message. And some of those they play out differently when it comes to executive presence. So I want to put that caveat out there that I see so many of you from so many different regions of the world. It's absolutely fascinating. To know that it's important to put this information in the context of your cultural norms, your cultural environment. Very, very important. So I'm going to ask you another question. When you think of an executive presence, the topic we're talking about today, what do you think are some of the key ingredients? What do you think goes in to giving someone executive presence? Before I give you the answer, let's see what comes to mind for you. What do you think makes somebody have executive presence? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Let's see what you think. What gives somebody executive presence? What are some of these ingredients? Let's see what you all think, and let's see what the chat says. Boy, you all are very active in the chat. It's fabulous. Absolutely love it. We've got some answers to some previous questions still coming in. Diane says self-awareness. Okay, what else? Confidence, says Laura. Excellent. Izzy says empathy. Definitely. Hello, Izzy. Good to see you here. Confidence. Okay. Boy, we could bottle that and sell it, right? Awareness of your audience and confidence, says Lydia. Emotional intelligence. Posture, says Rhonda. Hussein says experience. Nice. Self-awareness, Samir. Thank you. Empathy, active listening, respect. Can you have executive presence if you don't have respect? Look at these fabulous ability to remain calm in stressful situations. Helen, that's a fabulous ad. Okay, Izzy, ability to kind of pivot or change direction if you need to. Nice. Charisma. Tara says communication. Love that. Humility. Wow. Maybe you all should be teaching this with me. You're all so engaged and you absolutely have all the right answers. Well, yes, as elusive as this thing is, executive presence, it has certain ingredients. But before we go to those, let's talk about what executive presence is not. It is not rank and status. So your job title does not give you executive presence. We see people all across the organization at all different levels and stations who have the ingredients of executive presence, but they may not have the job title. Executive presence is not just for men. Interestingly, there is research to say that when most people think of leaders or they think of people who carry a lot of influence or have a lot of impact, which is important, they typically think of men. But we know that as women are ascending, with strides into those leadership ranks, that women are also carrying a lot of those executive presence ingredients. And executive presence does not mean that you're able to convince, coerce, or gain compliance. So it's not about command and control, right? You all know I do a lot of work with the military, and sometimes it gets a little confusing when we think about leadership strengths, executive presence, and command. We're not talking about getting people to fall in line. We're not talking about having them agree and comply because they're afraid of something else, right? Afraid of repercussion. We're talking about the ability to use all these gifts and all these ingredients to command attention, to get people to receive your message in the way it is designed and intended. So, what is executive presence? Well, typically, executive presence contains three main ingredients, and you all pretty much captured them with some nuances. The first is this word gravitas. And first of all, I just love saying gravitas. I think it's a really cool word. But gravitas is your ability to communicate vision, having the credibility to be able to share a message with confidence. So you're all absolutely right. Confidence is important. To be able to communicate confidence in a credible enough way with enough nuance and decisiveness that the people receiving that message hear you, are willing to take action on that, or at least receive and consider what you're sharing. Gravitas is probably the most elusive of the ingredients of executive presence because it's one of those, again, going back to the research I shared at the beginning, people know it when they see it, but you don't really know what it is, right? It is the way somebody walks into the room. It's the way that they conduct themselves. It's not arrogance. It's not pride, but it is a calm sense of confidence and integrity that is rooted in mutual respect and ensures that the person with confidence, when they share something, is heard. The second big ingredient is image. It's perception, right? It's what I see. So it's really that nonverbal part of the communication. Executive presence has a lot of nonverbal impact, and that often comes through in our body language, right? So when you're talking to someone, are you looking at their eyes or are you looking at the screen? Because the faces are all down here, but their eyes are up here. Is your body language showing open posture and welcoming, rapport building, approachable image? Do your clothes and the way that you style yourself, the way you present yourself, show intention? Image has a lot to do with executive presence, but it's not all. So, the third component that's often talked about is what I love to unpack the most when I teach this kind of programming, and that's communication. How do you share your message? So, is your message clear? Are you considering the emotional intelligence of the people you're speaking with? Do you have some element of charisma? And charisma doesn't have to mean on stage show stopping charm, but there is some element of charisma that makes people pay attention to what you're saying. When I teach this, we wrap that around storytelling and we really unpack the ingredients to being able to communicate a clear message with emotional intelligence to a target audience. But for our sake, let's think about those three ingredients as the key pillars of executive presence. So we have gravitas, which is your integrity, your decisiveness, your ability to create and sell a vision. The second is image. So what I see, your nonverbal communication, your body language and posture, the tone of your voice, and how well you modulate that, the image that you project, what you wear and how you style yourself, and communication, how clear you are at being able to create and craft an idea and then be able to sell that. Someone with executive presence has mastered all three of those ingredients. But I want to take it a little bit further because I think there's more to executive presence. And this is what I'd like to share with you. I think executive presence also carries a service mindset. And what I mean by that is this is someone who says, I'm a leader, not a manager. I want to empower others. I care about you as the person receiving my message, receiving my vision. And so you're part of the conversation with me. Having a service mindset, I think, elevates executive presence The individuals that I work with, whether they're working for NGOs or government organizations or tech companies or financial firms, when they have executive presence, they really care about the people that they're sharing their message with. And that care, that feeling of service to them comes through in how they communicate. And that's where we don't have to worry so much about arrogance or bragging or boasting, because their service mindset tempers the gravitas in that direction. Hope that made sense. The next ingredient that I add is empathy, vulnerability, letting people know you're human, right? We all have a heart beating in our chest. And so connecting human to human is really important to having executive presence. This is not a monologue, it's a dialogue. And when you can connect to human beings in real, empathetic, vulnerable ways, you build relationship. You go from being transaction to being advisor. Vulnerability doesn't mean weakness. But if you've ever studied the work of Brene Brown, you know that vulnerability means sharing your humanness, sharing your open-ended questions, letting other people in. You still get to protect yourself. You still get to keep yourself safe. But being vulnerable might mean saying, I don't know the answer to that. I'll find out and get back to you. Or this topic makes me nervous. I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead that effort. Somebody with executive presence is going to be mindful of the amount of empathy and vulnerability they bring into a conversation. The next one I would add, number 3, is inclusivity. And it's a big topic today, but here's what it looks like in executive presence. The person who brings that inclusivity into the conversation pays attention to their words, their visuals, the way they behave. They bring others into the conversation. So they're not going to start an email with, hey guys, or a video with, hey bud, dude, right? Those are not inclusive terms. When I show PowerPoint presentations, I am very mindful to make sure that everyone is represented, because it's important that people feel included. I show diversity. I show able-bodied and disabled individuals. I show all different generations, because the person watching your interactions is going to look for themselves in that conversation. And so I think inclusivity is an important part of executive presence. So think about your emails. Think about how you start off your Zoom calls, right? What is that welcome message? I like to say, hello, friends. I have a colleague who has a really cute catchphrase, and that's how he says, hello, friends, but I'm not going to give it away. He says it in a different language, which I think is absolutely fabulous. How are you welcoming people into the topic that you're going to share, into the meeting that you're going to run, into the email that you're going to share with them? Think about how you can bring other people in. And the last point that I would add, and many of you indicated this, so again, y'all are right on track with me, is self-awareness. Are you clear about your strengths, your areas of improvement, right? Now, there are blind spots, and they're called blind spots because we typically don't know about them. But someone who has self-awareness in their executive presence is going to be open to hearing input about how they could learn and grow better. Self-awareness is a tricky one, because I've yet to meet a client when I ask them about their level of self-awareness who doesn't say they're really self-aware. But most of us aren't as self-aware as we think. We just think we're self-aware. So leaning into that part of executive presence really means an openness. It means being able to ask questions and listen for input. Remember, if you've followed any of my personal branding work, or you've read any of my books like Control the Narrative or Reputation 360, then you know that self-awareness does not mean getting feedback that you have to act on. It just means being open to receiving input and then deciding whatever's best for you to go forward. So yes, executive presence absolutely requires gravitas. It requires that you manage the optics, the image, the nonverbals, and it does require that you control and manage the communication. But I add those additional ones. I add the service mindset, the empathy and vulnerability, the inclusivity and welcoming others into the conversation. And I add self-awareness to the formula because I've seen a lot of people grow their executive presence into the next level, which is leadership presence. And I have yet to meet a client or a colleague or admire someone from afar who doesn't have those additional ingredients. So, of the ones I just mentioned, which are the ones you think you have the most opportunity to work on? Which are going to be areas of focus for you? Go ahead and put it in the chat. What are the ingredients for executive presence that you're going to work on going forward? This will help me also curate content for you, but let us know. If you feel comfortable, just share with us what you think you're going to work on. Are you going to work on your gravitas or maybe your image? Maybe you haven't updated your style in 15 years. Maybe you're still wearing all the yoga pants that we wore during the pandemic, and now you need to go back to the office. Maybe you're not as clear on your messaging. Do you have a service mindset? Are you sharing empathy? What are the ingredients that you're willing? Thank you, Jason. So Jason says self-awareness. He's going to think more about that. Empathy. Okay, excellent. These are hard ones, right? These are things not taught in school. We're taught that we're supposed to know these intuitively, but where's that rule? Gravitas. Okay, communications. Nice. A lot of you communication. We've got some great resources. Be sure, if I haven't mentioned it, that you sign up for my newsletter. I cover these topics a lot. And if there's something I haven't covered that you'd like me to share more about, just drop me a message. I'm happy to do that. Vulnerability, professional image and self-awareness, gravitas and self-awareness. All right. So maybe this is the year that we stop saying we're self-aware and we actually dive into that. Well, let me give you some tips for building your executive presence. Okay. First is that you listen as well as talk. So oftentimes when we think about executive presence, we're thinking about how we're talking, how we're saying, what we're communicating. But we gain so much more if we start opening our ears and hearing what others are saying. Don't be the only one talking in the room. You're not going to learn if you're always doing the talking. So pay attention to the messages being shared by other people. The second one is read the room, right? If you've heard that expression, it means assess the situation, develop your situational awareness. In fact, and I know my wonderful right-hand person, Sabrina, is going to drop it in the chat. Just last week, I wrote an article about how to read the room, and she's going to put that in the chat. So be sure you head over to read that article as soon as I'm done. But reading the room means you start becoming aware of how your message is landing. If you're sharing a message and people don't get it, maybe they don't have enough information to meet you where you are. Maybe you overestimated or assumed they were more up to speed. Maybe they don't have the ability to make decisions. And so you start reading the room to determine if they're tracking with you, if there's resistance, if they're on board. Who are your advocates and sponsors in the room? Who are your opponents or people who might have conflict with what you're sharing? Start building your situational awareness to get the temperature. And the same thing goes, and I think you can do this online as well. And I don't just mean in virtual meetings, but through your posts on social media, through your emails. What is the response? Are you getting engagement? Are people positively reinforcing what you're saying? Are they answering your questions when you give them a prompt? So that's the second one, is read the room. The third, and this is hard for me, this is my hardest one, is use silence strategically. I love to talk, but sometimes there's power in not talking. So what happens when I stop talking, right? Everybody goes, uh-oh, did I miss something? Did my technology go out? And the words sit a little longer. Think about how you can not only listen more than you talk, which was number one, but how can you use silence strategically? Having executive presence means confidence. And so having executive presence and confidence means you can let your idea sit for a minute. You don't have to, as salespeople call it, sell beyond the close. Let the idea sit there. See what questions come up after that. See how people start sinking that message in. Start reading the room and taking the temperature. How is it all working? And then next is check in, ask for feedback. How is that message I just shared with you resonating? Does it sound like something you could get on board with? Are you having trouble understanding what I'm talking about? Can you think of ways you can expand this and unpack that even more? Having executive presence, and specifically when we talk about communication, means checking in, asking for feedback. Be willing to take the feedback. It doesn't mean you have to change who you are. We don't want you to change who you are. Branding is all about being your best self. But sometimes we have to modulate. Sometimes we have to adjust our behavior or modify our communication to make sure that our message is being heard. If I'm speaking on a college campus or to a university audience, I'm going to choose different words than if I'm speaking to a group of Wall Street bankers or to an international crowd. Because again, we always have to consider those cultural norms and environments. So be sure to ask for feedback, get those check ins. And then finally, number 5 is stay on brand. Executive presence for you doesn't have to look like it does for someone else, right? You mentioned at the beginning, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. They have their own style of executive presence. Your style of executive presence with all those ingredients looks like you. And when you define your value proposition, when you define your brand, then stay on brand. Dress on brand for you. Communicate using words and energy and tone that's appropriate for you. This is not about modeling after someone else. We can learn best practices. We can get ideas and tips from other people, but it's really important that we internalize them as ourselves. Remember, a really important part about building your brand, building your presence is consistency, not perfection. I couldn't teach perfection. I couldn't help you become perfect. Nobody can. We're human beings. We're internally and inherently flawed, but we should be consistent. So my goal in managing my own executive presence is to bring the same level of empathy and energy and service mindset and inclusivity and gravitas that I would in a LinkedIn Live, that I would on stage, that I do in my books, in my TED Talk, all of it, because consistency is how we build trust. People will forgive the 1 or 2 times maybe your executive presence falls flat, but it's really important that consistently, more times than not, I experience you a certain way. So we've covered a lot of ground, and we are going to take time for questions. You always know I leave that for the end. What is one thing we talked about today that you're going to start doing, right? So are you going to start listening more than you talk? Are you going to maybe learn a little bit more about how to read the room? Are you going to try out using silence strategically? What about asking for feedback? Do you have tools right now? Are you going to start doing that? And are you going to level up your focus for staying on brand? Feel free, if you're comfortable, putting it in the chat of the action items I gave you, of those steps. What are some things that you're going to start thinking about? And maybe you have questions about that, and that's fabulous. Leave it. We're going to get to that in about 30 seconds. But to wrap it up, there's some things you can do right away. First, become aware of your body language. Pay attention to how you're communicating nonverbally, right? And some of you are putting that in the chat. Fabulous. Pay attention and start being mindful of how you portray yourself, and then start learning about the body language of other people. There's a lot of misunderstandings around body language. So if you're not up to speed on it, read some of the articles I've written, go online, learn about body language, make sure you're not falling into any of the traps of assuming people are angry if they do this, or assuming they're shut off if they do that. But start paying attention to that aspect of how you're communicating your executive presence. Second, try using strategic silence. And I see some of you are starting to put that in the chat. Try using it. It's going to feel awkward. It will feel 10 times longer to you than it does to the other people. But it catches people's attention, right? If I all of a sudden go radio silent, everybody stops and listens. Make sure you're doing it strategically, though, not to manipulate, but so that what you say can land, it can stick, people can absorb it. We get so much input, so much information on a daily basis. And third, I would encourage those of you who are maybe doing presentations, showing PowerPoint. I know we're all writing emails and sending text messages, Slack messages, instant messages, and emails. Start thinking about how inclusive you are in those messages. Are you, without even realizing it, excluding people? Do the people receiving your message feel that you're speaking to them? Really, really important. So that's executive presence. And I know we did this in a really quick overview. I teach this in a longer program, even a full day program, but we've just scratched the surface, and hopefully you've gotten some good takeaways about what you can do to build your own executive presence. Before I get to questions, I do want to tease what we're going to talk about next month, because I have a really special guest, a woman you're going to absolutely be blown away by. She is going to help us talk about women in leadership, which is a really important topic globally and also to me. I coach women executives and professionals all over the world, and their experiences are so unique, at the same time so similar. And my guest is not only a military veteran, not only active still in the Guard and Reserves, but she works for one of the most prominent global banks, Wall Street banks. And she's going to share her experience being a woman growing in the corporate leadership ranks. So make sure you watch out for my messages on LinkedIn. Sign up for my newsletter. I'm going to be talking about it, and dial in and join us next month for that program here on LinkedIn Live. So let's see what some of the questions are. I do see one that I'll go ahead and answer. Yeah. So Sabrina answered, do I have a website? I would love if you would look at my website. We relaunched it towards the end of last year. It's lita360.com. And thank you for that question. Diane asks, using strategic silence, it's more difficult to do in virtual environments for me. It is because, and Diane, I think I know what you're getting at. As soon as we go quiet in a virtual environment, what's the first thing people do? They grab their mouse and they start wiggling and wondering, did somebody hit mute? Is something wrong with technology, right? I think if you use it strategically, then what you're going to say is, I want to share 3 really important points with you. So get ready. Here they come. First, right? So because virtual still means I can see you, your silence gives people the ability to say, oh, okay, what's coming is really important. And there's 3 of them. So now I'm listening for 3 things. It's always going to feel different in a virtual environment because people panic about the technology. But if you do it, start practicing it. Practice in smaller bites using it in a virtual environment and see how that works, and use it strategically, not just because you think people fell asleep. Perfect. What's another question? Let's see. I'm looking at questions. And Sabrina, who manages the chat with me, says, oh, Tara has a question. Active listening and using silent strategy, often ramble to fill in the void. You and 99% of everyone else out there, because silence feels awkward. Right. And trust me, it takes practice. I would definitely say practice this so that you don't look awkward as you're doing it. Filling the void sounds like rambling, and all of a sudden a really important chunk of message starts getting diluted. It's like you just added water to it and thinned it out. If you're practicing, if you're preparing your message, if you're thinking strategically about how you want to communicate, right? I teach a lot around storytelling, and that means having certain ingredients lined up. What's your key message? What are your supporting points? Then you're inserting silence strategically to make sure that those messages stick. And if you think it through and you practice, then you're going to be able to manage the silence a little more effectively. It will feel awkward to you. Just know that it will. it doesn't feel as awkward to the other person, and it doesn't feel as long to them as it feels to you. Thank you for that. Brad says, best way to address a question thrown at you and you genuinely don't know the answer. Um, Boy, don't we all get that? I teach a lot with technology companies, and sometimes they'll randomly ask me a technology question, which not only do I not know, I really don't want to know because that is not how my brain thinks. If you genuinely don't know, I wouldn't brush the question away because you want to make sure you honor the fact that it was asked with earnest. But to be able to consider it for a moment, and your body language is going to show that you're considering it, and then say, that's a really good question. It's honestly one that I don't have an answer for you right now. Would it be okay if I got back to you with that? And then if it's a one-on-one conversation or a small group, say, Brad, I'd like to be able to follow up. I'm going to research that and get back to you tomorrow with that. If you're on stage in front of 5,000 people and you get a question you don't know, and it's in your area of expertise, so it's kind of something you should know, consider the question and reflect back. That isn't something I've studied, but you've just given me a fabulous idea for some research. I hope you'll connect with me, follow me, because I'm going to unpack that. I'm going to learn more about that. And I'll be sharing that answer online or in a future program, however you want to address it. I wouldn't say, to Tara's point, don't start rambling. Don't fake it. Don't come up with an answer. If it's something you should know, don't come up with an answer that the audience might be able to tell isn't right. But let them know that isn't something you've considered, or that's a different perspective than you've thought about. I've had that happen to me many times in front of an audience. And it's a fabulous opportunity for me to learn. And maybe there's other people in the room who can help me in that learning. But then I always let them know how I'm going to get that information back out to them. So, Brad, I love the question. I hope that answered your question. Lydia, build consistency with my personal brand, so I'm always showing up the same no matter the event. Consistency is king, right? It's king, it's queen, it's prince, it's princess, it's everything. Because we're not going to be perfect, but we should be consistent. On stage, in person, in writing, verbally, build consistency. Really try to look at the areas, listen for feedback where you're not being consistent. Really important. Any other questions coming in? Anything I've talked about that you're kind of going, still not quite sure about that one? Or can you talk more about that? I'm happy to spend a few more minutes if you have additional questions. But I think we've talked about a lot of the high points, right? Think about gravitas, pay attention to your image. And let's face it, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of us just went back to what we were wearing before. Is that still appropriate? Did you change jobs? Did you change companies? Is your work style different? And know that people do judge by what we see. We also judge by what we hear. So think about that communication. Work those other touch points in your emails, in your communication in person, in front of a small group, in front of a large group. Carry yourself with confidence. And yes, there are going to be times when your knees are knocking. Maybe you don't feel on your best, but lean into it. Show your vulnerability. Let people know you're a human being. We connect with human beings, right? Companies don't talk to companies. People talk to people. And don't forget that as you build your executive presence, go out in the world and build your leadership skills in the direction that is most meaningful and impactful to you and your legacy. I am so thrilled to be with you today. Next month, as I mentioned, we're going to have another special guest talking about women in leadership. Be sure to stay tuned for that. I look forward to connecting on LinkedIn. Please sign up for my newsletter so you get all the information and the tips and all the alerts of what's coming up. And I wish you all a wonderful day wherever in the world you are. Thank you and be safe. Bye.